seriously, all of the talks today have been absolutely incredible, and the new discoveries in the field are mind-blowing when we think of the technologies and the biomarkers and the genetics. Yet, I'm still baffled by the fact that the majority of individuals with autism who don't have cognitive impairment are still failing to obtain levels of independence in their life, particularly throughout adulthood. And so I'll be talking about adaptive behavior, or functional practical skills, so I do have to disclose that I am an author on the Vineland 3. So it's the end of the day. I'm giving you a history lesson. So right across the Hudson, there was a very important place in our history called the Vineland Training School for the Feeble-Minded. So in the very early 1900s, this was the nomenclature for intellectual disability. And my forefathers in clinical psychology were literally obsessed with IQ at that time and developing measures of intelligence because they felt that this was the end-all, be-all of what made someone functional and contribute to our society in this country, except Edgar Dahl. He was working at the training school, and he felt very strongly there was more to just intelligence. And he talked about something called social competence, which he defined as the functional ability of a human being to have personal independence and social responsibility. So he developed what is the first measure of adaptive behavior, the Vineland Social Maturity Scale. He defined adaptive behavior as age-related, meaning when you're little, you have less practical skills than when you're older. It's defined by the expectations of others because we live and are immersed in a social world. And this is the take-home message for the day. He said, it's defined by typical performance, not ability. It's the does-do, not the can-do. So, can the little girl on the right in that picture brush her teeth? Yes, you have picture proof. She's brushing her teeth. But if I asked you, does the little girl on the right in that picture brush her teeth with independence, no prompt supports, reminders, or help? My husband said I can't answer that question because this is being recorded. So, why is this important in autism? Because autism is a social disability, and when you have a social disability, you're not monitoring the people in your world. If you're not monitoring others, you're not modeling others. And as the great Bob Schultz told us this morning, that leads to impaired imitation skills. And imitation is a building block of social competence. So remember, the repertoire skills, that's capacity or intelligence. In autism, the does-do is the application of those skills to real life when real life demands the behavior. Modifiable, so adaptive skills you can actually change. If you don't know how to dress yourself, you can teach someone to dress yourself, then you have the skill. So intervention impacts it, lack of intervention impacts it, trauma, illness, geographical location change, all these can change adaptive behavior. And then it's the only thing in life you want to be solidly average at. You don't want to be an overachiever in adaptive behavior because you don't want a 5-year-old, for example, driving a car. So now let's fast forward to the 1970s. And now all definitions of intellectual disability involve both deficits in cognition and deficits in adaptive behavior. Thank you, Edgar Dahl. So a law came into play that hopefully some of us still believe is a good law outside of government called the IDEA Act, and that mandated that children who were being evaluated for special needs were evaluated with standardized measures, including standardized measures of adaptive behavior. Well, the Vineland Social Maturity Scale was well outdated by this point, and so the publishers sought out to find an expert in the field, and they found Sarah Sparrow, a leading expert in intellectual disabilities at the Yale Child Study Center. She and her husband, Dominic Cicchetti, who's a biostatistician, did the entire standardization of the measure, along with their colleague, David Bala. And they stayed very true to Edgar Dahl's definition of adaptive behavior, and I actually have to say I'm proud to say that we did that with the Vineland 3 as well. Now, Sarah and Dom were really at the forefront of research on adaptive behavior profiles in autism. In fact, we now call it the autism profile of adaptive behavior, where adaptive skills we know fall below age expectations and usually below IQ. And the greatest area of deficit is socialization, so that's no big surprise. But what we're finding now is that this gap between cognition and real-life functional skills really is only apparent in individuals with autism who don't have cognitive impairment. They're the ones who have the capacity to be independent, but they're not naturally learning how to do that. And even more concerning, this gap is wider in older versus younger kids. And so, very preliminary, I don't even want to show you the data yet because we're just looking at this now. In infants who are high risk for autism, who go on to develop autism by age 3, we are seeing this widening gap between early developmental skills and adaptive skills between 12 and 36 months. So it's happening that early. And as a diagnostician, when I diagnose someone with intellectual disability and autism, one of the first things I recommend are functional daily living skills, right? Teach this person how to dress themselves, bathe themselves, know how to manage money, know how to take public transportation, interact with people in the community. Why don't we do that for the individuals with autism who actually are quote unquote high functioning, knowing that they are not naturally acquiring these skills? So we know the literature tells us that good predictors of outcome have historically been IQ and language. If a child does not have cognitive impairment and they have language by age 5, they're going to have a better outcome. However, more recent research is telling us that adaptive behavior might actually be a better predictor of good outcome. One of the people in our world who is doing the best research probably on adult outcome in autism is Patricia Howell in the UK. So she defines good outcome as holding down a job, living independently, and having quote unquote good social relationships, enough to navigate our social world. So when she looked at a group of adults that did not have cognitive impairment, 24% of them were actually acquiring enough skills to have this good outcome. However, the vast majority of adults were not. More sobering, she followed up these same adults 20 years later, and the percentage of adults with this good outcome decreased. We're going in the wrong direction. So we do actually know that if you target adaptive behavior in an intervention, you can improve adaptive behavior. Go figure. It's that modifiable. So even when the intervention isn't about adaptive behavior per se, so for example, in a very large clinical trial using a parent training manualized 16-week program to decrease problem behavior in autism, one of the modules in this parent training program was teaching the parents about adaptive behavior, in particular daily living skills, personal and domestic daily living skills. And lo and behold, at the outset of 16 weeks, there was an increase across the board in adaptive skills. So, to tell you an anecdotal story of how I learned about adaptive behavior, because we all learn from people with autism and their families. So I'm going to tell you about a young adult, a girl. We've been talking about girls with autism. Her name is Dylan, and she gave me permission to tell this part of her story. And I said, you know, Dylan, can I show a picture of you? And she said, yeah, if you show the picture of us when we were little. Because not only does she have autism, she has a sense of humor. So I worked with Dylan as a behavioral therapist. So I worked with her 40 hours a week, this poor soul. I had to chase her around with my reinforcement belt, with my M&Ms and my Skittles and, you know, my juice and my potato chips, and drill, 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 drill. Now, one of the skills that I was tasked to give her was eye contact, right? So I sat across the table with her for hours. Dylan, look at me, good job, M&M. Dylan, look at me, good job, M&M. Dylan, look at her, good job, Skittle. Dylan, look at him, good job. So, I don't know if you know this, but in applied behavior analysis, a mastered skill is 80% accuracy over 3 consecutive trials in 3 different contexts with 3 different people. I mastered that skill. I was awesome at what I did. Mastered skill. I taught this girl to stare at everybody in her environment. In fact, I got her to stare at the cameraman in that picture. We actually commented on what a good job I did. She's looking at the cameraman. So, I can assure you, when you are the recipient of that eye contact, there was nothing functional about it. So one day I was working with her, she was about 5. I just stopped what I was doing and I asked her, Dylan, what on earth are you looking at? And without skipping a beat, she goes, I'm looking at me in your eyes. So I don't know how much you like the person sitting next to you, but if you look really closely, you can see your entire reflection in their eyeball. I didn't know that. So something like 1,000, 2,000 trials, I taught her a new stereotypical behavior that she didn't otherwise have. So that's when it was time for me to go to graduate school. And because she doesn't have cognitive impairment, she went on into the academic environment. And because David Mandel wasn't around, I think he was probably still in high school, that there weren't good educational programming for children with autism in general, let alone the high-functioning ones, right? So she got no services. So after several years of failing to get the school system on board, her parents took her out of school. I hesitate to say what they did with her was homeschooling because very little of her education happened in the home. A few years ago, I went to dinner with her, and we were joking about the story I just told you, and I said, you know, Dylan, your eye contact's pretty good now. I mean, pretty good. She still has autism. And she said, yeah, I don't like looking at people. It's not natural for me, and I don't want to do it. So I asked her, well, then what's different? She said, well, my mom taught me when and why I needed to look at people. And so I know when I have to. Dylan is now a chef in a 5-star restaurant in New England. And her mother, like many of the mothers here and dads and around the world, deserves a PhD in common sense. So my second take-home message for you, other than it's not the can do, it's the does do, is if you're working in the field of intervention with individuals with autism, especially those without cognitive impairment, whatever is being taught needs to be functional, it needs to be meaningful, and it needs to happen early. Thank you.